Dr. Elena Rodriguez had always believed in the power of healing. Working as a trauma surgeon at Denver General Hospital, she had seen her share of broken bodies and shattered lives. What she hadn't expected was to have her own life turned upside down by the very institution she had dedicated herself to serving. The hospital's new administrator, Marcus Wellington, had arrived 6 months ago with promises of efficiency and cost-cutting measures. Elena had watched as he systematically dismantled programs that helped the most vulnerable patients, all while padding his own salary and that of his cronies. The breaking point came on a stormy Thursday evening in March. Elena was finishing her shift when the emergency alarm sounded. A military transport had crashed just outside the city limits, and multiple casualties were incoming. Among the wounded was Captain Jake Morrison, an F-15 pilot whose aircraft had gone down during a training exercise. His injuries were severe: internal bleeding, broken ribs, and a punctured lung. Elena worked for 14 hours straight, refusing to leave his side even when Wellington ordered her to hand the case over to a less experienced surgeon to save on overtime costs. "Dr. Rodriguez, you're exceeding your authorized hours," Wellington had said, his voice cold and calculating. "Dr. Peterson can handle this from here." Elena looked at the young resident, barely 2 years out of medical school, then back at the critical patient whose life hung in the balance. "This man needs someone with experience. I'm staying." Wellington's face darkened. "This is insubordination. There will be consequences." But Elena didn't care about consequences. She cared about saving lives. Captain Morrison pulled through, thanks to Elena's skill and dedication. During his recovery, he learned about the doctor who had refused to abandon him. He was particularly moved when he discovered that Elena had been reprimanded and had her pay docked for the overtime violation. "She could have let someone else take over," he told his squadron mates. "But she stayed. She saved my life." What Morrison didn't know was that Elena's troubles were just beginning. Wellington had been looking for an excuse to get rid of Elena ever since she had publicly questioned his decision to cut funding for the hospital's free clinic. Her defiance during the Morrison case gave him the ammunition he needed. Over the following weeks, he began building a case against her, citing policy violations and questioning her judgment. He reassigned her to the night shift, reduced her surgical schedule, and began documenting every minor infraction he could find. Elena's colleagues watched in horror as one of their most skilled surgeons was systematically targeted. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the chief of surgery, tried to intervene, but Wellington had the backing of the hospital board, most of whom were more concerned with profit margins than patient care. "Elena, I'm sorry," Dr. Hayes said during a private meeting. "My hands are tied. Wellington has convinced the board that you're a liability." Elena felt the walls closing in around her. She had given everything to this hospital, and now she was being pushed out by a man who saw medicine as nothing more than a business. The final blow came when Wellington accused Alina of falsifying patient records. The charge was completely fabricated, but it was serious enough to trigger an investigation by the medical board. Alina's license was suspended pending the outcome, and she was banned from the hospital premises. As she packed her belongings from her office, she felt a mix of anger and despair. 20 years of service, and this was how it ended. She had saved countless lives, including that of Captain Morrison, but none of it seemed to matter now. Standing in the hospital parking lot with her career in ruins, Alina made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to let Wellington destroy her without a fight. She had documentation of his corrupt practices, evidence of his mistreatment of staff, and a growing list of allies who had witnessed his abuse of power. If he wanted to play dirty, she would show him what real consequences looked like. Little did she know that her salvation would come from an unexpected source, the very pilot whose life she had saved. Captain Morrison had been following Alina's situation through mutual contacts at the hospital. When he learned about the false charges and her license suspension, he was outraged. "This is wrong," he told his commanding officer, Colonel Rebecca Torres. "Dr. Rodriguez saved my life, and now they're trying to destroy hers over some administrator's power trip." Colonel Torres, a woman who had faced her own battles with institutional corruption, listened carefully to Morrison's account. "What do you want to do about it, Captain?" she asked. Morrison's jaw tightened. "I want to help her fight back, ma'am. She didn't abandon me when I needed her most. I'm not going to abandon her now." What Alina didn't know was that Captain Morrison had connections that extended far beyond the military. His father was a prominent attorney who specialized in whistleblower cases, and his sister worked for the state medical board. More importantly, Morrison had friends in high places who owed him favors. When he reached out to his network, he discovered that Wellington's corruption went much deeper than anyone had suspected. The administrator had been skimming money from hospital funds, falsifying insurance claims, and taking kickbacks from medical supply companies. Alina was at her apartment, reviewing legal documents and preparing for the fight of her life, when she received an unexpected phone call. "Dr. Rodriguez, this is Captain Jake Morrison. I think we need to talk." Alina remembered the name, the pilot she had saved months earlier. "Captain Morrison, how did you get my number?" "That's not important right now, Doctor. What's important is that I know what Wellington is doing to you, and I want to help you take him down." Alina felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. "I'm listening, Captain." The meeting took place at a small cafe downtown. Morrison arrived in civilian clothes, but Alina could see the military bearing in his posture and the determination in his eyes. "Dr. Rodriguez, I owe you my life," he began. "When I heard what Wellington was doing to you, I couldn't stand by and do nothing." He slid a manila folder across the table. "My father is a lawyer, and he's been investigating Wellington based on information I provided. What you're looking at is evidence of systematic fraud and corruption spanning 3 years. Elena opened the folder, her eyes widening as she read through the documents. Financial records, witness statements, and internal memos painted a picture of an administrator who had been using the hospital as his personal piggy bank. "This is incredible," Elena whispered. "How did you get all this?" Morrison smiled grimly. "You'd be surprised what people will tell you when they think they're talking to someone who might be able to help them. A lot of hospital employees are fed up with Wellington, but they're too scared to speak up on their own. When they heard that a military officer was asking questions, they started coming forward." Elena felt tears of gratitude welling up in her eyes. "Captain, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me, Doctor. You saved my life. Now it's my turn to save yours." The plan Morrison outlined was elegant in its simplicity. While Elena fought the false charges through official channels, Morrison and his father would build a case against Wellington that would expose his corruption to the authorities. But they needed more evidence, and they needed Elena to get it. "You mean go back to the hospital?" Elena asked. "How? I'm banned from the premises." Morrison's smile was predatory. "Not if you're there as a patient advocate. My father has arranged for you to be hired by a law firm that represents patients' rights. It's perfectly legal for you to be on hospital property in that capacity." Elena felt a thrill of anticipation. After weeks of feeling helpless, she finally had a chance to fight back. The next phase of the plan required careful coordination. Elena would return to the hospital under her new role, gathering evidence and documenting Wellington's ongoing misconduct. Meanwhile, Morrison would use his military connections to ensure that the evidence would reach the right people in law enforcement. "We need to be careful," Morrison warned. "Wellington is smart, and he's dangerous. If he suspects what we're doing, he'll try to destroy the evidence and silence anyone who might testify against him." Elena nodded, understanding the risks. "I've been fighting him for months, Captain. I'm not going to back down now." Elena's first day back at the hospital was surreal. Walking through the halls where she had once worked as a respected surgeon, she now moved as an outsider, watching and listening for any sign of Wellington's corruption. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. In the administrative offices, she overheard a conversation between Wellington and his assistant about a shipment of medical supplies that had been paid for but never delivered. The missing supplies were worth over $50,000, and Wellington was trying to cover up their disappearance. Using a small recording device provided by Morrison's father, Elena began documenting everything she witnessed. She spoke with nurses who had been forced to work with substandard equipment because Wellington had purchased cheaper alternatives and pocketed the difference. She interviewed janitors who had been ordered to use diluted cleaning solutions to save money, despite the increased risk of hospital-acquired infections. Each piece of evidence added to the growing case against Wellington. But Alina knew they needed something bigger, a smoking gun that would make the charges stick. The opportunity came when Alina discovered that Wellington was planning to sell the hospital's entire supply of a critical medication to a black market dealer. The medication, used to treat cardiac emergencies, was worth over $200,000. Wellington intended to report the medication as expired and disposed of, while secretly selling it for personal profit. Alina knew this was the evidence they needed, but she also knew that patients' lives would be at risk if Wellington succeeded. She had to act fast. Alina contacted Morrison immediately, and he arranged for federal agents to be standing by. The plan was to catch Wellington in the act of selling the medication, but first they needed to prevent him from completing the sale. Alina knew she had to take a significant risk. She would have to confront Wellington directly and try to delay him until the authorities could arrive. It was dangerous, but Alina had never backed down from a fight when lives were on the line. The confrontation took place in Wellington's office late on a Friday evening. Alina had used her access as a patient advocate to enter the building, and she found Wellington preparing to move the stolen medication. "Going somewhere, Marcus?" she asked, stepping into his office. Wellington spun around, his face going pale when he saw her. "Dr. Rodriguez, what are you doing here?" Alina smiled coldly. "I'm here to stop you from killing people with your greed." Wellington's expression hardened. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Security." But Alina had anticipated this. Morrison's military friends had quietly arranged for the security guards to be called away on a false alarm. "Your security won't be coming, Marcus," Alina said calmly, "and neither will your buyers. The FBI has been watching your little operation for weeks." Wellington's eyes widened in panic. "You're bluffing. You have no proof of anything." Alina pulled out a thick folder of documents. "I have proof of everything. The skimmed funds, the kickbacks, the falsified records, all of it. And in about 5 minutes, federal agents are going to walk through that door and arrest you." Wellington looked around desperately, then lunged for the phone on his desk. Alina was ready for him, stepping forward and knocking the phone out of his hand. "You destroyed my career, tried to ruin my reputation, and put patients at risk," Alina said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Did you really think I would just walk away and let you get away with it?" Wellington backed against the wall, his confident demeanor crumbling. "Dr. Rodriguez, we can work something out. I can make this right. I can get your license reinstated, give you your job back." "Too late, Marcus. You should have thought about that before you decided to play God with people's lives." The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of the federal agents. Alina stepped aside as they entered the office, badges displayed and weapons drawn. "Marcus Wellington, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy," the lead agent announced. As Wellington was handcuffed and read his rights, Alina felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in months. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being delivered with surgical precision. The aftermath of Wellington's arrest was swift and thorough. The FBI investigation revealed the full extent of his corruption, including the sale of expired medications, the diversion of funds meant for patient care, and the systematic harassment of staff members who had tried to expose his misconduct. Alina's name was cleared, and the false charges against her were dropped. The medical board not only reinstated her license, but also issued a formal apology for the investigation. Captain Morrison was there when Alina returned to work at Denver General Hospital. He had been medically cleared to return to active duty, but he had requested a delay to see Alina's vindication through to the end. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said, approaching her as she entered the hospital for her first shift back, "I wanted to thank you again for saving my life and to congratulate you on your victory." Alina shook his hand warmly. "Captain, I should be thanking you. You saved my career, my reputation, and probably my sanity." Morrison smiled. "We saved each other, Doctor. That's what good people do." The hospital board, embarrassed by the scandal and facing potential lawsuits, offered Alina a substantial settlement and a promotion to chief of surgery. She accepted the promotion, but donated the settlement money to establish a fund for whistleblowers in the medical field. "People need to know that there are consequences for corruption," she told the local news reporter covering the story. "And they need to know that there are people willing to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult." Wellington was eventually sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for his crimes. The stolen medication was recovered and returned to the hospital, potentially saving dozens of lives. Several other administrators who had been complicit in Wellington's schemes were also prosecuted, and the hospital implemented new oversight measures to prevent similar corruption in the future. Alina had not only cleared her name, but had also struck a blow against a system that had allowed greed to override patient care. Months later, Alina received a letter from Captain Morrison, who had returned to his squadron and was preparing for deployment overseas. "Dr. Rodriguez," he wrote, "I'm writing to let you know that you've inspired me to be a better officer and a better person. Your courage in standing up to corruption, even when it cost you everything, reminded me why I chose to serve in the first place. I hope that if I'm ever in a position to help someone the way you helped me, I'll have the strength to do what's right." Alina smiled as she read the letter, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with the knowledge that good people still existed in the world. The story of Dr. Alina Rodriguez and the corruption scandal at Denver General Hospital became a case study in medical ethics courses across the country. Alina was invited to speak at conferences and seminars, sharing her experience and encouraging other healthcare professionals to stand up against corruption and abuse of power. She always ended her speeches with the same message. We took an oath to do no harm. That oath doesn't just apply to our patients. It applies to our profession, our institutions, and our society. When we see wrongdoing, we have a responsibility to act, even when it's difficult, even when it costs us personally. Alina's relationship with Captain Morrison evolved into a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. They stayed in touch through letters and occasional visits, supporting each other through the challenges of their demanding careers. Morrison often told people that meeting Dr. Rodriguez had changed his life in ways that went far beyond the medical care she had provided. "She showed me what real courage looks like," he would say. "It's not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway." The impact of Alina's victory extended beyond the hospital walls. Her case inspired other healthcare workers to come forward with their own stories of corruption and abuse. A national movement emerged, focused on protecting whistleblowers in the medical field and ensuring that patient care remained the top priority in healthcare institutions. Alina found herself at the center of this movement, using her platform to advocate for systemic changes that would prevent future Marcus Wellingtons from putting profits over people. Years later, as Alina looked back on the experience that had nearly destroyed her career, she realized that it had actually been a turning point that led to her greatest achievements. She had not only reclaimed her position as a respected surgeon, but had also become a voice for integrity in health care. The scar on her professional reputation had healed, leaving behind something stronger and more resilient than what had been there before. The lesson of Dr. Alina Rodriguez's story was simple but powerful. When good people stand together against corruption and abuse of power, they can create change that extends far beyond their own circumstances. Her courage in the face of systematic persecution had not only saved her own career, but had also protected countless patients and inspired a new generation of healthcare workers to prioritize ethics over expediency. In the end, the F-15 pilot she had saved had returned the favor, proving that heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the people we help find ways to help us in return. The bond between Alina and Morrison remained strong throughout their careers, a testament to the power of mutual respect and shared values. They had both learned that true strength comes not from position or authority, but from the willingness to stand up for what is right, even when standing alone. Their story became a beacon of hope for others facing similar challenges, proof that corruption and abuse of power could be defeated when good people refused to remain silent. Alina's triumph was complete, but it was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new chapter in which she would use her experience and platform to fight for justice and integrity in healthcare. She had learned that sometimes the most important battles are not fought in operating rooms or emergency departments, but in boardrooms and courtrooms, where the soul of medicine itself is at stake. And she had learned that victory is sweetest when it is shared with those who stood by you, when the fight seemed impossible to win. The mark of the woman who had saved Captain Morrison's life was not a physical scar or tattoo. It was the indelible impression of courage, integrity, and compassion that she had left on everyone whose life she had touched. In saving others, she had ultimately saved herself, and in fighting for justice, she had created a legacy that would inspire others long after her own battles were won. The F-15s that had once represented the barrier between her and freedom had become symbols of the allies who had helped her soar to heights she had never imagined possible. In the end, Elena Rodriguez's story was not just about one woman's fight against corruption. It was about the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice. Her victory belonged not just to her, but to every healthcare worker who had ever stood up for their patients, every whistleblower who had risked their career to expose wrongdoing, and every person who had chosen to do what was right instead of what was easy. The woman who had saved a pilot's life had, in turn, been saved by the pilot and the community of supporters who had rallied to her cause, proving that in the end, we all have the power to be heroes in someone else's story.